Hello everyone, this is Nicolina from Appraisal. We would like to thank you all for joining today's webinar on Systematic Literature Review, how to empower data-driven decisions in your organization, brought to you in partnership with Criterion Edge. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application widgets you can use. All widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A widget. We will try to answer as many as possible during the webinar, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, we'll make sure to follow up with you in a separate email after the webinar. A copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources you may find useful. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. Also, a reminder to look out for an email within the next 2 hours with a link to access the webinar on demand. At this point, I'd like to briefly introduce you to our presenter. Joining us today, we've got Laurie Mitchell, who's the founder and president of Criterion Edge, and who has more than 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management and regulatory reporting. Laurie is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges and is a published author and holds a Master's of Nursing from UCLA. So without any further delay, let's get started. I'll hand you over now to Laurie.
For the introduction. Welcome to Systematic Literacy and how this process can provide data to help companies make informed, data-driven decisions more easily. I hope this webinar will present you with practical guidance on how to conduct a robust systematic literature review and insights into how the data can be used to support organizational decision-making. Case studies will be presented that highlight scenarios when companies use the systematic literature review process to identify and extract published data to support critical internal decisions or initiatives. Companies need data to meet global regulatory requirements, to inform organizational strategies and direction, and to guide critical decision-making. Those are just a few examples. But performing a systematic literature review, or SLR, can present multiple challenges to a team. For example, is there access to the right expertise, such as a medical librarian, to consult with and design a sound search strategy? Are regulatory compliant SLR processes in place that describe robust literature search, screening, and selection activities? And lastly, even with all of the above, executing the steps of a systematic literature review requires people. Even with tools and technology, there's no way to remove trained human eyes and brains from the process. The screening, review, and selection steps take time and people, both of which may be in short supply within a company. Bottom line is that maintaining consistency and increasing efficiency when conducting an SLR is difficult when there's a lack of available resources, or the steps are ill-defined, or manual processes are used that are slow and prone to error. In today's regulatory landscape, adopting a transparent, reproducible process for literature reviews is essential. The objective of our session today is to review currently accepted SLR practices and provide guidance for designing and conducting a rigorous literature review from search strategies through screening, data extraction, and reporting. At the conclusion of this webinar, you will know how leveraging published data can help meet regulatory expectations and inform your internal decision-making, why systematic literature review is superior to a simple internet search, and steps for conducting a methodologically sound literature review. We'll start with a description of the framework of a literature review and also examine how an internet search is much different from the systematic literature review process. An SLR is a clear and methodologically sound plan for the identification, retrieval, selection, appraisal, and weighting of published data. This definition is taken from the 2009 article by Moorer et al., in which the authors described the PRISMA statement, which is a reporting structure for the results of systematic literature reviews and meta-analyses. Systematic review methodology is nothing new. It has long been the gold standard process for evidence-based research, especially in the academic and professional arenas. The data derived from this method has long been used, for example, to develop clinical practice guidelines and recommendations, and describe and support academic-based research initiatives, among other applications. Those same rigorous principles are now being mandated by global regulatory authorities and have been adopted by pharmaceutical, medical device, and IVD manufacturers as best practice. Consider conducting a systematic literature review when there is insufficient manufacturer available data to address an organizational need or a regulatory requirement. Some examples of these situations could be to learn more about off-label usage of your drug or device, to support requests from and responses to regulatory authorities, to prepare a clinical evaluation report for EU MDR compliance, to develop white papers or other clinical marketing materials, to gain insight into unknown hazards, to assess the current therapeutic landscape, or to inform recommendations for additional clinical or non-clinical analyses. But first, let's establish the key differences between an internet search and a systematic literature review, because they are certainly not equivalent to each other. Internet searches should be considered ad hoc because they don't follow a predetermined, planned methodology as a systematic literature search does. This graphic presents the high-level differences between the two types of searches. First, can the search results be considered comprehensive and thorough, extensively scoped across all relevant literature sources? The answer for an internet search is definitely no. The results are dependent upon the limited capability of internet search technology, the availability of published literature, and the relative skill of the searcher. However, the comprehensiveness of a systematic literature search is a definite yes, with a couple of caveats. It must be assumed that the search strategy was designed by a person knowledgeable in advanced search terminology, and a robust search platform that supports advanced search capabilities was used. Can multiple literature databases be searched? No, not on the internet. Google Scholar is not really considered a database, and PubMed is the only major literature database that can be accessed on the internet without a paid subscription. However, again, it is assumed that the systematic review search is run on a platform with access to all relevant databases, minimally Embase and Medline. Can the search platform support flexible search terminology? No, the internet cannot. Searches are dependent on keyword selection, or in the case of PubMed, only the AND search function is supported. To achieve the comprehensive results from your literature search, the search strategy must use advanced mesh terminology and search syntax. This requires the use of a robust search platform such as Ovid or ProQuest Dialog. Is the methodology clearly documented and reproducible, reliably yielding the same or very similar results each time? A definite no for an internet search. However, A well-documented search strategy conducted on a search platform will reproduce nearly the same results when run again and again. And lastly, can objectivity in screening and selection of the literature be demonstrated? This characteristic relates not to the literature search, but to the criteria used in the literature screening and selection process. It is possible to apply the same rigor and level of documentation employed to an SLR screen results to the screening and selection of literature identified on the Internet. However, if the search process itself is already questionable, it hardly matters if the screening and selection process is well described. The battle for objectivity is already lost, so to speak. Now let's dive into the details on the methodology of the systematic literature review. Here is a bird's eye view of the basic steps of every systematic literature review. Develop and define the research question or questions that are under investigation. This is also called the scoping step. Design the search strategy and conduct the search using all relevant literature databases. Screen all literature references returned from the search by applying predetermined exclusion and screening criteria to define the selection process. Extract relevant data from those full-text articles that were included during the screening process. And finally, synthesize, organize, and analyze the extracted data into a report to answer the research questions. And there we have the steps: scope, search, screen, extract, report. The first step is to define the research question, which is really a key step in the overall scoping of the literature review process. You should identify the purpose of your search. Basically, what do you need to know? Then establish clear research questions that will support that purpose. Determine where to search by identifying any relevant databases such as Embase, Medline, SciSearch, and others. And decide if other sources of data will be considered, such as unpublished literature or web content. A well-defined scoping process provides the foundation for the entire literature review. It is essential to ensure that the search questions are clear, that the literature search planning process is thorough, and the search strategy is well documented. Takeaways for this scoping process are: take the time to determine clear research questions and document your process for transparency and reproducibility. Consider developing a literature search scoping worksheet to guide and document this process. We have done this within our organization, and we find it to be a very, very useful tool. Using the framework from the scoping exercise, the next step is design and run the literature search. Here you will need to identify key search parameters, such as relevant search terms, for example, product names, PICO terms. If you're not familiar with the PICO acronym, it stands for patient or population, indications or interventions, comparison or comparator, and outcomes. Determine your exclusion criteria for article selection, such as foreign language to exclude, animal studies, do you want to exclude, technical articles, these might be all examples of articles you'll want to exclude from the search. You'll need to establish certain search limits, such as time range, study type, or levels of evidence. For example, will you exclude abstracts or conference proceedings from the search results? A couple of takeaways at this step are: use a librarian with experience designing medical information search strategies. Maintain a record of all literature results returned by the search. This documents that all potentially relevant articles were considered for inclusion. This slide highlights some of the best practices for literature screening. One defining feature for systematic literature screening is the use of robust methods to minimize selection bias. Successful screening depends heavily on clearly defined eligibility criteria, which are identified during the scoping step. Literature screening is a very human part of the overall process, and screeners should be trained on and strictly follow the eligibility criteria for inclusion. It is at this step that the eligibility criteria translate into screening decisions. For example, perhaps during the scoping session, perhaps you defined a certain performance criteria data point as a rate of restenosis at 1 year. You're interested in that data. If the screener is reviewing an article that only reports restenosis rates out to 30 days, that article would be excluded based on that criteria. It doesn't meet the criteria that you established during the scoping. This example is only meant to point out that decisions made at the scoping step have a direct impact on the screening and selection process, so those initial decisions translate directly to screening decisions, making them very important. Transparency and reproducibility are critical components of the screening process, and you should definitely be tracking your screening decisions to comply with global regulatory standards, documentation standards. Lists of excluded references and the reason for their exclusion are common and expected reporting requirements. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise anyone to imagine that the volume of literature to be screened can be huge. One strategy and a takeaway, really, to manage this challenge and make the screening process more efficient is to use a multi-stage process where the first level of screening includes review of only the title and abstract to identify those more straightforward screening decisions, such as, well, perhaps the article is in a foreign language. That's an exclude. Or is it technical data only? Doesn't help you. Exclude it. Or is it not related to the research question or drug or device under evaluation? You can easily exclude it just by reviewing the title and abstract. Those decisions are quick and easy. This first stage can save time by identifying those obvious includes and culling out the obvious excludes. Those left fall into what we call the maybe pile, where a review of the full text article is necessary to determine the final screening decision. Taking this approach can save you time and money and expends less manpower during the screening process. Here we are talking about data extraction and appraisal step 4. Data extraction should be prospectively planned and consistent. Extract PICO data that really serve to inform and elucidate the questions for your review. Remember, that's data related to the population or patient, intervention or indication, comparator, and outcome. That's PICO data. Another critical element of data extraction is the clear identification of relevant safety and performance or efficacy outcome data, as you will be extracting those data as well. The use of predefined, easy-to-use forms is advised to help guide the data extraction process, as it helps avoid human error, which often arises out of manual processes. Using data collection forms, whether you have a platform to build those in or even a simple Excel spreadsheet, can ultimately result in cleaner data and greater efficiency. Lastly, take care that data extraction is performed at the study level. This allows you to not double count the same data, which may have been reported in, for example, 2 different journal sources. So imagine if you're reviewing 100 articles, and somewhere Article 13 that you reviewed had the same data as article number 97, and you just don't remember that. You don't remember that it's 2 different authors or 2 different cuts, perhaps, of the same data that's being reported. So this is always an issue during screening and data extraction to make sure you're not double counting data. So using screening software that allows you to link related citations really helps to avoid this potential problem. Distiller SR is one of those platforms that helps you track this. Finally, to the last step of the systematic literature review process. Let's touch on the importance of transparent documentation of your literature review process. We talked earlier about the PRISMA reporting structure, which is a clear systematic flow diagram that documents each step of the review process. You're seeing here one right here. Here's an example of a typical PRISMA flowchart documenting the results from each step of the literature search, screen, and review process. Documentation requirements may vary depending on where your report will be submitted or how it will be used, but typically will include some or all of the bullets shown on this slide. Your search strategy and output, that transparent description of your methods for data inclusion and extraction, weighting and appraisal, all are common documentation requirements. A PRISMA flowchart is typically included as part of your documentation to regulatory authorities and major journals. Certainly they will always want to see that. By the way, and I mentioned this earlier, if you use Distiller SR as your literature screening and management platform, creating a PRISMA flowchart is automatic and very easy. The takeaway here is this. As a rule of thumb, your documentation should be sufficiently detailed to support full replication, as we talked about earlier. So the importance of transparent reporting cannot be overstated. Now let's review 3 case studies that highlight ways organizations can inform their decision-making using data derived from the systematic literature review process. This first case study highlights a company that was developing a unique device technology used to treat colorectal cancer. In this case, the company wanted to identify published competitor data to support their own device's clinical development plan. This is a case study that illustrates how internet searches don't have the same value as a more rigorous systematic database searches using platforms such as Ovid or ProQuest Dialog and using mesh terminology. Excuse me. The client requested SLR services to identify relevant competitor evidence to support their early evaluation of the device, as I said. The clinical team had worked extensively to develop and run multiple internet searches, attempting to identify their required data, but their searches consistently returned literally thousands of citations, and try as they might, they were unable to meaningfully reduce the number of hits on their searches. The volume was just too much, and the results were clearly unfocused, rendering the search results essentially useless. The Criterion Edge medical librarian and our literature search team worked directly with the client to help in the following ways. Multiple review questions were established for 3 separate searches. So there were 3 separate searches, and each search had multiple review questions. This allowed us to break the searching up into manageable parts. The number of citations across all the searches ultimately totaled less than 1,000, which, by the way, was down from an original 5,000 plus citations that the team had been getting using the internet. Data related to current treatment options, disease burden, and risks were extracted from the screen search results. The extracted data were compiled and analyzed to address the review questions, and the result was the clinical development plan was updated to reflect additional information gleaned from the reviewed data. This is a case study related to the importance of the initial scoping process and identification of clear and specific research questions, which we, of course, touched on briefly in the slide before. This case, however, involves an oncology biotech company, which during the process of working with their patent application office, identified the need to update and expand their definitions of minimal residual disease, or MRD, and transplant eligibility. As such, we were approached to conduct a systematic literature search, extract and compile the relevant information, and summarize the findings. Critical to the success of this project was the identification of the search rationale and scope. What type of data was the client looking for? Clinical data extracted from published studies and/or definition used in practice guidelines and consensus statements. That was a critical decision point at the very beginning. Ultimately, it was agreed to use consensus statements and professional practice guidelines from pre-identified sources, thus focusing the search and eliminating many hours of unnecessary searching and screening by our team. The justification for the search strategy was clearly documented, and the screening methodology was robust and transparent. The updated definitions were accepted by the Patent Office and adopted across the organization by the company's clinical development teams. Lastly, this case study highlights the need for rigorous screening criteria and clear data extraction methodology. A large medical device company was considering a design change to one of their endovascular stents and needed to gather more real-world data on current usage and procedural outcomes on their stent and compare those data to competitor stents of a different design. Medical Affairs was tasked with preparing a design change justification report for senior management review. The search yielded over 200 articles, all of which were reviewed, and based upon the predetermined screening and exclusion criteria, 66 articles were ultimately included for data extraction. Multiple data points were extracted and analyzed on all stent designs included in the search. Those data points included the number of patients, demographic data, indication, and type of procedure performed, procedural success, length of follow-up, and adverse events. The result and analysis were provided to the client for review and discussion with our management team. Based on the report findings, management ultimately decided to move forward with a recommended design change. Thank you. This brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope you found the information informative and have gained additional insights into the steps for conducting a robust systematic literature review and ways to use published data to meet your regulatory expectations and inform critical internal decisions and processes. I'll now turn it over to Nicolina as we begin to discuss any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lori, for this insightful presentation. Before we move on to the Q&A portion, there is a few polling questions we would like your feedback on. First question, who in your team, department, or company manages systematic literature review for you? Next question, how do you manage SLR? Thank you for the feedback. Next question, how often do you or your organization perform SLR? Within your department at this time, how many SLRs need to be completed? And a follow-up question on that, when do you need this done by? Thank you for the feedback. So one final question, which of the following is the biggest issue in your systematic literature reviews? All right, well, thank you all for submitting your answers. We do have some time for questions, so please keep those coming in. If we don't manage to address all of your questions just now, make sure that we will be following up with you after the webinar. So, Lori, first question. You mentioned about using software to reduce the risk of double counts. The software is in-house developed or is it commercial?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening to the webinar so far, and thanks for your questions. This is Lori. The software that I was referring to is commercial. We haven't developed anything in-house, and we try to do this work through using Distiller, and our team, our Criterion Edge team of reviewers, uses Distiller exclusively for screening all of our systematic literature reviews and managing those results and the output. So I would recommend looking into Distiller SR, which is a part of the Evidence Partners platforms of software.
Great, thank you, Lori. Moving on. Our institution does not have a librarian. How can I internally access OVID, for example, to conduct my SLR?
So that's Ovid. And I'm not a librarian, so I don't exactly know how you access Ovid to other than through a paid subscription. That's the only way that I know how. Again, we spent some time talking on this presentation about how internet searches are not the same, excuse me, not the same as more of a controlled search through a platform that, such as ProQuest Dialog, that has access to many databases. So I've not really used Ovid. Our librarian uses ProQuest Dialog to help launch her searches.
Thank you. Another question that has just been submitted, Lori. How important is Embase to a systematic literature review in a clinical evaluation?
So this is a clinical evaluation of a medical device. I'm assuming to be in compliance with MDR regulations that will be taking effect next year. So Embase, I can say, is actually specifically called out as one of the databases in some of our regulations in the medical device world. It's called MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4. MedDev Rev 4 specifically mentions the importance of key databases to do your searches in, and they called out Embase and Medline. So that's a shout out to those two particular databases, which I think handle most literature. But we use, again, our team uses a platform called ProQuest Dialog. I think you might have heard me mention it a few times. And our librarian and our search team runs our searches through ProQuest Dialog. And that platform has access to many, many, many databases. But by far, Embase and Medline are the heavy hitters when it comes to databases. So I would say those are very important.
Thank you. And how many literature databases do you normally use for your literature searches, and which ones would you recommend the most?
Well, as I said, we primarily use the two, Embase and Medline, and those would be the ones that I would start with. We do work with clients sometimes that have very specific data that they are looking for, and because they're the subject matter experts essentially on their data, their devices or drugs, they will also sometimes be familiar with less visited databases where their data may be housed and may not be found easily on Embase and Medline. And we have used some more, I would say, obscure databases to find data in some instances.
Thank you. Moving on. At what stage do you start your SLR? Is it in phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3?
I'm not sure I understand the question. At what phase do you start your SLR? Phase 1, 2, or 3? I'm not sure what that means. Maybe it means something with regards to the medical device searches. And phase 0 is usually considered the scoping section, which then moves directly into phase 1 after that, which would be when you would be queuing up and designing your systematic literature review and initiating the search. So if that's what the question is about, I hope I answered it. I think the bottom line is, for any process, any question that you need answered, getting back to my presentation, the first step is very important, the scoping step. That's where you're defining your research question and honing in on exactly what it is you need to know. And once you have clarity on the type of information you need and the questions you need answered, you move directly into getting a really strong search put together that's focused, but will give you the answers that you need. So that's a very early step in the process of answering your questions. Get that search done, because it can take time to do the screening.
Thank you, Lori. Do we have to do the literature search and external clinical experience database search for both device under evaluation and the equivalent device, or only for the device under evaluation?
So again, this is a question for medical devices and in compliance with the new MDR regulations that are coming. And if I think I heard the question right, is it required to do a literature search both on the subject device or devices that are under evaluation and on the competitor devices, did you say, Nicolina, or the equivalent devices? What was the question? Equivalent or competitor devices? I apologize.
Equivalent.
Equivalent. With the equivalent devices, you had the assumption there is that you are comparing for equivalence the subject device under evaluation to an equivalent comparator. One of the assumptions with that is that the equivalent comparator already has data associated with it, clinical data associated with it that's strong, and perhaps your subject device is new to the market or has very little of its own clinical data. And so you must marry those two, essentially, by establishing equivalence between the equivalent comparator and your subject device. So you do need to establish that equivalence in order to use the data from both. You should run a systematic literature review search on both if it's necessary, because all data that any data that you have is data that's important, and you should be looking for that.
Right, thank you. In your opinion, Lori, how many articles do present sufficient clinical data for a medical device under evaluation for a clinical evaluation report of Class 2 or Class 3 device? How
many articles are needed? Is that the question?
Yes.
Basically, to establish, yeah. Well, I think the questioner may guess what my answer is. It's not about the number of articles, it's about the amount of data. And if you find high quality studies that are published with large data sets, numbers of patients, relative to, of course, to the population that your drug or device operates in. It really has to do with the quality of data, the quality of the study, and the N number, the number of patients that are exposed to your drug or device. That's the marker that you're looking for. And if the question implies that you could stop after a certain amount of time because you've, quote, got the data you need, that for regulatory compliance in the medical device world, that's not good best practice. You must screen and look at all data and include and exclude all data available within the time frame of your literature search. You don't get to stop when you think you've got enough. That's not a best practice for systematic literature review.
Thank you, Lori. We do have many questions submitted. Please keep those coming in. Another one has just been submitted. How can the SLR process help me in protocol design?
First thing that comes to mind is background, certainly the background, building the case for the research questions that your protocol is answering, it wants to answer. So I would say from the point of view of presenting background, therapeutic landscape, where your drug or device exists in that therapeutic landscape, what problem it's solving, indications, medical conditions, so forth. That is a critical contribution of systematic literature review to protocol development. Also to get an idea of what is already out there in the published literature that relates to your drug or device and the research questions that you want to answer in your protocol, in your clinical study.
Thank you, Lori. Can you talk about how the SLR process can support the post-market surveillance?
So post-market surveillance, again, I'll speak from a device standpoint. Post-market surveillance is and I am not a post-market surveillance expert. We are Criterion Edge, we're regulatory writers, and we are subject matter experts on the reports that we put together, from protocols to CERs to CSRs, and certainly PMS reports. With regards to systematic literature review, we have had clients ask us that very question: how can you help with this? It's my understanding that in PMS best practices in post-market surveillance, the passive collection of data, that is not only the passive collection of data that is coming in through established channels into the manufacturer or the drug company, but also going to scan published literature on, say, an every 6-month basis for your drug or device, and then screeners can look at those included articles for any new harms, adverse events, off-label usage, and other types of key questions like that. For post-market surveillance, the company would get a better handle on what's happening out there in the world with their drug or device. And a systematic literature review with those questions, those types of research questions, can definitely help you answer that, collect data on it, and then report it as part of your PMS reporting practices.
Great, thank you for that. Moving on, managing large searches is very difficult in terms of resources. How can we tighten up the search and selection of articles?
There's a couple of critical factors in that. Tightening up a search is another way of saying to focus your search effectively, and I really do mean effectively. Focusing doesn't mean necessarily narrowing so that you are missing critical data. There's a fine point in there between casting your net so wide that you've stuffed your search, your screening with hundreds, perhaps, maybe thousands of articles that are, for lack of a better word, just junk. They don't apply. But on the other hand, the other end of the spectrum is becoming so focused that you miss critical data. So I would answer that question in two ways. One is the scoping, the asking your research questions, going over those key search terminology. What are you going to choose? What are the right words to put in your search? What are you looking for? And then choosing keywords wisely and key search terms wisely, and then using an experienced medical librarian, because they know how to design the search strategy, the search protocol, use that syntax, mesh terminology and syntax effectively to compile a search that is very focused and effective. So medical librarian and really digging into the effective search terminology and key search terms.
Thank you, Lori. All right, so next question. Is this discussion only pertaining to devices, MDR, or does SLR apply to drugs as well?
That's a great question, because I know that many people in the audience, whether they're IVD companies or medical device companies, have their focus, they're laser focused on the upcoming MDR regulations and then the following upcoming IVDR regulations. But thank you so much for asking a question with regards to pharma. And welcome everybody to from pharma on this systematic literature review conversations. And here's how we've helped pharma companies with employing systematic literature review. One of the case studies that we talked about where the company needed to know more about some background information with their transplant eligibility and other questions. That was a question that they had essentially to develop their protocol and to focus their company's resources in perhaps a different direction than what they were assuming that they needed to go into. So think about from the standpoint of how also systematic literature review can be deployed in a company to help with marketing, to help with the focus of gathering data on your drug, on its perhaps off-label usage. Do you need to know more about developing a white paper or other information to feed up to management to make decisions with regards to changing the formulation, new indications, new intended uses for your drugs? There is a lot. At the end of the day, a systematic literature review conducted well provides you with data. That's the point of this whole presentation. It provides you, the company, with data that is in the published arena, or even with guidelines and professional guidelines, pulling all that data together, answering your question, whatever it is, so that you can make the company can make a data-driven decision. So the sky's the limit. If you have a question and data can answer it, systematic literature review can help you.
All right, thank you, Lori. All right, I think we have time for a few more questions. Is this discussion, sorry, this was the one we just did, and the next one, my commercial team tend to have very broad scope. What recommendations do you have to help them narrow down the review questions?
That's an interesting question. That's great. I would say that collaboration with a team that does systematic literature reviews might be a first step. If for example, the Criterion Edge engaged with this commercial team and they had that and we have engaged with commercial teams. And another one of the case studies was the commercial team within a pharma company. They were basically talking to themselves. So they didn't know what they didn't know, and they kept hitting these internet searches and large searches that came back with 5,000 plus articles. But when they collaborated with us and we brought that a different perspective to the table, we began to work together to see what their questions really were, and then how those can be effectively focused, and what is necessary to ask and what is sort of a red herring. Don't ask that question. That isn't relevant. So I would say collaboration from an outside party, because sometimes it's hard when it's a team to not be. This isn't a negative. This is meant negatively. It's hard not to be your own echo chamber, and when you get an outside perspective, that can really kind of unlock new directions.
Thank you, Lori. Another question that has just been submitted. When reviewing literature, how acceptable is it to state a publication cannot be retrieved, even if several attempts to obtain it have been made?
It's acceptable, is the short answer. That's acceptable. Several attempts to obtain it have not been made. If the article is considered critical, I mean, we've gone as far as reaching out directly to the author, but that's as from a regulatory standpoint, to show due diligence, it is acceptable to state that, to describe that, you know, we've done X, Y, and Z, we've looked here, we've looked there, the article is not obtainable, and so we just move on. So it depends on if the article is very critical. You can go all the way to reaching out to the author, but that's pretty much the end game. If the author doesn't respond, and you can't get the article, you're sort of stuck at that point.
Thank you, Lori. So I think we have time for a couple more questions before we wrap up today's session. Can you talk about an example where you helped a company to develop a clinical strategy for their product using the SLR process?
A clinical strategy for their product using the SLR strategy, using the SLR process. Well, I hate to keep going back to the presentation, but the clinical, I think it was the last case study where again, getting back to the pharma company that wanted to understand more about the MDR, I think MRD, minimally resistant, I don't remember what MRD stands for. And that was for a patent office, and they were that was for a patent office request, and they were looking really to strategize whether they wanted to take that particular drug further down their clinical strategy pathway, or did they want to abandon it? And the answers were in what kind of data they got from these searches. Is that, in other words, could they achieve the goal that they want from their clinical strategy to further develop the drug, or was the drug going to possibly fall short? So I would say from a clinical development standpoint, early strategic decisions can be made beyond the research and development phase as the company is beginning to look at what's out there in the clinical world, understanding the scope of the patient population and the scope of the disease, and looking at epidemiological factors, you know, how many people are affected, and doing that kind of a profile can help him form a clinical strategy of a drug.
Thank you. And one final question. Could you please repeat which searches we need to document the methodology for, apart from the main literature review?
I'm going to interpret that as being a medical device question, which searches we need to document the methodology for apart from the main literature review. So assuming that we're talking about searches for the clinical evaluation of a medical device, and assuming that we're talking about MDR compliance, then you need to document your methodology. I guess the short answer is you document your methodology for all searches. In a clinical evaluation, there are two or three really primary searches, one being the subject device under evaluation, that the published literature of that, understanding the competitor landscape, and thirdly, doing a search for to inform the state-of-the-art section. The methodology for all those searches must be documented.
All right. Well, thank you, Lori, and thank you all for submitting your questions. That is all the time we have for questions today. Thanks again for sending those in. A reminder to look out for an email within the next 2 hours with a link to access the event on demand. On behalf of Criterion Edge and Marcus Evans webinars, we would like to thank you all for joining us, and we do hope that you'll be listening in at our next webinar. Thank you all.